Chromosomes determine the sex of an individual, and in humans, the 23rd pair of chromosomes are the sex chromosomes. So a female will have 2 X chromosomes, and a male will have an X and a Y chromosome. And on the Y chromosome, there's an SRY gene that causes the testes to develop in the fetus, which will then start secreting the hormone testosterone, and that's what makes the male develop. And the female, not having a Y chromosome, does not have the SRY gene, and so she will go on to develop into a female. And each egg that the female will produce contains an X chromosome, and the sperm that the male produces will contain either an X or a Y chromosome. And then here's a picture of what the X chromosome looks like on the bottom right, and then here's what the Y chromosome looks like. So you can see there's a big difference in their sizes. The X chromosome does have a lot more genes on it than the Y chromosome does. So there are a lot more genes on the X chromosome that are determining things other than just the sex. And the Y chromosome generally just has genes on it that are just determining sex. So let's take a look at some karyotypes. And karyotypes are just a picture of the chromosomes that an individual has. And what they do is they take a picture of the chromosomes and then match them up into the homologous pairs. So let's take a look at the individual on the left here. And so you can see here's our homologous pair of chromosome number 1, and then we've got chromosome number 2, our homologous pair there. And then here would be our sex chromosome, our 23rd pair. And this would make this individual a male because you've got an X and a Y chromosome. And then if we look at our karyotype over here on the right, and we go over here and look at our sex chromosomes, we have 2 X chromosomes. So this would be from a female. All right, so looking at the eggs and the sperm that are produced, so notice that the woman, when she produces her eggs, she has 2 X chromosomes. So remember that the law of segregation, these X chromosomes, half the eggs will have 1 X and the other half will get the other X. So the eggs will only have an X chromosome in them. So that's it, there's no other choice. So only X chromosomes in the eggs. And then for the males, they have an X and a Y chromosome in the cells that are producing the sperm. And so when we do meiosis and make the sperm, the law of segregation says that we're going to separate the X and the Y. So half the sperm will get an X chromosome and the other half of the sperm will get a Y chromosome. So when we do our Punnett square, and looking at just these X and Y chromosomes to determine the sex of the baby, you can see that half of the offspring will be female and the other half will be male. And then which parent is going to determine the sex of the baby? And as you can see, it's going to be the male, the father, that's going to determine the sex of the baby, because mom is only going to contribute an X chromosome, whereas the dad will contribute either an X or a Y chromosome depending on which of the sperm will fertilize the egg. So it's the dad that determines whether it's going to be a boy or a girl. All right, so let's take a look at genes that are on the X chromosome. So these are called X-linked genes. And some of these genes we have either dominant or recessive alleles for a particular gene. And for some of these genes, the recessive allele may cause a disease. And if you have a recessive X-linked trait, for that to be seen, or what we call expressed, a female would need to have 2 copies of the allele, okay, in order for that recessive disorder to be seen. So for example, if we have color blindness, the red-green color blindness gene is located on the X chromosome, and the recessive allele, the lowercase letter, would mean that you're going to be colorblind. But if you get the dominant allele, the capital letter, you would have normal vision. So in order for a woman to be colorblind, she would have to inherit 2 copies of the recessive allele on the X chromosome. So she would have to be homozygous for that recessive allele. Whereas a male who only has 1 X chromosome only needs 1 copy of that recessive allele in order to be colorblind. And this is why it's much more common to see these X-linked recessive disorders in males than it is to see them in females. And that's why. Okay, so let's just take a look at some crosses here. So we're going to look at this red-green color blindness, and we're going to have a normal male, and we're going to cross with a heterozygous female. So our normal male, so remember, capital N, we have normal vision. And then if you have the recessive allele, you would be colorblind. Okay, so our father has normal vision, so we've got the dominant allele. And then the mother also has normal vision because she's a heterozygote. So she's got the dominant normal allele, and that's going to mask that recessive allele. So she's going to have normal vision. Okay, but she's what we call a carrier. Okay, so when you have these recessive disorders, the heterozygote will be a carrier. So she's normal, but she can pass on that recessive allele to her offspring, and then they could be affected. So that's a carrier. Okay, so with our possible gametes, so for the father, we're just going to segregate the XN and the Y. So half the sperm will have X big N, and the other half of the sperm will have Y. And then for the eggs from mom, half the eggs will have X big N, and the other half will have X little n. And then when we do our Punnett square, we'll have a normal female with X, X, and 2 big N's. And then we're going to have X big N, X little n, and this girl would also have normal vision, but she's going to be a carrier. So she does carry that recessive allele, but she does have normal vision. And then we're going to have a normal male, and then we do get a colorblind male. Okay, and then if you look at this circle over here on the right, hopefully you see an 8. And if you don't see an 8, then you're probably colorblind. You have red-green color blindness. And then here's just another one just to show you how we could get a colorblind female. So in order to get a colorblind female, you'd have to have a colorblind father with a mother that's a carrier. So she's heterozygous. And this way you could get the recessive allele coming from mom, and then the recessive allele coming from dad, and that's how you could get a colorblind female. Okay, so that could happen, but it's not as common as the chance of getting a colorblind male because the colorblind males only need one copy of that recessive allele on the X chromosome, whereas the female you need 2 copies. And so that's going to be harder to do in the females. Okay, and then on the circle over here on the right, you should see the number 45 in there. And if you don't, then you're probably red-green colorblind. Okay, and then here's another example of an X-linked recessive disorder. This is hemophilia A. And here we've got, well, we should probably make our allele key here. So if you have the dominant allele, you're going to be able to clot your blood normally. And if you have the recessive allele, you'll have hemophilia A. So you won't be able to clot your blood very easily, and if you just get a cut, you could bleed to death. So that is not good. Okay, so we've got a normal father here. Here's our X, big H, and Y. And then here's our mother. She's a carrier, so she's a heterozygote. So she's got X with big H and X with little h, so she will be normal. She doesn't have any bleeding issues, but she's a carrier, so she can pass on this recessive allele here. And then if we look at our offspring, possible offspring we can get, we've got a normal daughter, so 2 X's with 2 big H's, so no issues with the daughter. We can also get a normal son, X, big H, and Y. And then we could get a carrier daughter. She would be normal, but she could pass that recessive allele on to her kids. And then we can get a son with hemophilia. So we could have a 1/4 chance of getting a son with hemophilia. Okay, the other thing that we can look at are pedigrees. So these are just family trees that just show the traits of the parents and the children across the generations. And some of the hereditary disorders are caused by dominant alleles and some are caused by recessive alleles. And as we talked about before, if we've got a recessively inherited genetic disorder, then a carrier would be a heterozygote. Okay, so they would be able to pass on that recessive allele to their offspring. Okay, so maybe you had a recessive disorder like albinism. Okay, so the dominant allele would mean you're normal, and the recessive allele means you have albinism, or you would be an albino. And then a carrier would be normal, but we would call them a carrier because they're able to pass that recessive allele on to their offspring. Okay, so let's look at a dominant disorder first. This is called achondroplasia. So this is the most common cause of dwarfism. And with our allelic key here, big D will cause the dwarfism because this is a dominant disorder. And little d means that you would be a normal height. Okay. And here would be our parents. So we've got a dad that's a dwarf and mom who's normal height. We could never have a person who is homozygous dominant because this is actually lethal to the baby and the baby would not survive. So we just don't see these people in the population. So, but we do see the babies that survive would be a heterozygote. Okay. All right, so here's our dad. So half the sperm would have big D and the other half would have little d. And then mom, being homozygous recessive, all of our eggs would be little d. And then with our offspring, here's our Punnett square, and when you have a dominant disorder like this, you can see that half the offspring are going to be dwarfs and the other half will be a normal height. So let's take a look at this pedigree for a dominant disorder. So for example, maybe we've got dwarfism. So the way that you want to take a look at these is that we've got the squares with our unaffected males, and then our females would be circles, and then if they're affected, they would be shaded in. So how I like to read these is I start with the furthest down generations, and I take a look at the ones that are affected, and then I work backwards. So here we've got an affected individual here, an affected female, and if we go up and look at her parents, the father was affected, and then if we go and look up at the grandparents, we can see that the grandfather was affected. So what we see with these dominant disorders, like with dwarfism, is that you're going to see the disorder in every generation. So that's how you know it's a dominant disorder. So you'll see the disorder in every generation. Okay, let's look at a recessive genetic disorder. So let's look at albinism. So with our key here, we have big A is normal, and then little a, he would be an albino. Oops. Okay, so the only way that you could get an albino child if you had two normal parents is that both parents would have to be carriers. They both would have to be heterozygotes. So they both would have to have a copy of this recessive allele in order to get an albino child. Okay, so notice there's 1/4 or 0.25 or 25% chance of having an albino child. Okay, and then they have 2/4 or half a chance of having a child that's normal but is a carrier. So then they could then pass on that recessive allele. So here's a recessive pedigree. So maybe we're looking at albinism. And with this one, we've got a little bit different key here. We've got some individuals that are half shaded, and a half shaded individual would be a carrier. So they are normal, but they're carrying the recessive allele and they can pass it on to their offspring. So again, we're going to start with the generation that's the most current. So we'll start down here, and we've got an affected individual with albinism. And then if we look at the parents here, neither parent is affected, but they're both carriers. So they're both heterozygotes, but neither one has albinism. And then if we look at the grandparents and we go up here, neither one of the grandparents is affected, although one of the grandparents, the grandfather over here, is a carrier. And then if we look over here, we've got both grandparents over here are carriers. And then if we go up here to the great-grandparents, sometimes in history you're not sure, who was the carrier, but it just says one of these people was heterozygous, was a carrier. But what I want you to notice in the recessive disorders is that the recessive disorder is not going to appear in every generation. It oftentimes will skip generations. So that's how you tell that you've got a recessive disorder, because oftentimes it will skip generations. Okay, let's take a look at this pedigree analysis. So on our left, we're going to take a look at a widow's peak. You have a little triangle where the hair sticks out a little bit on your forehead, and then if you don't have a widow's peak, it's just smooth. So we need to figure out if a widow's peak is dominant or recessive, and if you have a widow's peak, you're going to be shaded in. So let's start here with our most recent generation. So we've got an affected individual here who does have a widow's peak. And then we look at the parents. Both parents have a widow's peak. And then we're going to look at the grandparents. And in this set of grandparents, the grandmother has a widow's peak. And then in the other set of grandparents, the grandfather has a widow's peak. And so you can see how a widow's peak is in every generation. And so this would be a dominant trait. And you can also see they've got the genotypes here, and you can see the big W. So widow's peak would be dominant. Okay, and then over here on the right, we've got the ability to taste a chemical or not. And we want to look at if you cannot taste this chemical, is that going to be dominant or recessive? Okay, and this chemical is pretty bitter, and if you're able to taste it, oftentimes you will think that broccoli or Brussels sprouts taste bitter. So we want to see if not being able to taste it is dominant or recessive. So if you can't taste it, you're going to be shaded in. So we'll start with our most recent generation here. We'll look at the parents. So both parents are able to taste the chemicals. So this individual that's shaded cannot taste it. And both parents here can taste it. And then if we look at the grandparents, this set of grandparents can taste the chemical. And then this set of grandparents, the grandfather cannot taste it. So if we look here, we are skipping a generation because the parents were able to taste it. And here we've got a grandfather that cannot taste it, just like this granddaughter. So this would be recessive. So not being able to taste this bitter chemical would be recessive. And you can see that with the genotype. You've got two recessive alleles, and you would not be able to taste the bitter chemical.